My toxic in-laws ruined my wedding, so I got payback. I should have seen it coming. My in-laws had never liked me. From the moment I met them, they made it clear that I was not good enough for their precious son, Daniel. His mother, Linda, was especially cruel, always dropping passive-aggressive comments about my job, my looks, and even my family. His father, Richard, barely acknowledged me unless it was to criticize something. Still, I naively thought they wouldn't ruin my wedding. I was wrong. The day started off like a dream. I was in my wedding gown, surrounded by my bridesmaids, ready to walk down the aisle to marry the love of my life. But then the disasters began. First, my bouquet was missing. A minor inconvenience, but strange considering my bridesmaid, Emily, swore she saw it just moments before. Then my makeup artist, whom I had booked months in advance, mysteriously canceled last minute. Luckily, my best friend was a makeup pro, so we made do. But things escalated at the ceremony. Just as the officiant asked if anyone objected to our marriage, Linda cleared her throat. My heart nearly stopped. She gave me a smug smile but said nothing, just letting the tension hang in the air. It was humiliating. Guests whispered. Daniel squeezed my hand reassuringly, but I knew his mother had already planted a seed of doubt in everyone's minds. At the reception, it got worse. My in-laws had changed the seating chart, moving my family to the back of the venue while placing themselves front and center. When I confronted Linda, she feigned innocence. Oh dear, there must have been a mix-up. She cooed, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Then came the final blow. When it was time for the father-daughter dance, I walked to the dance floor, only for the DJ to announce a mother-son dance instead. Linda had paid him to switch it, robbing me of my special moment with my dad. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them see me break. That night, I promised myself one thing. They were going to pay for this. I spent months planning my payback. I knew one thing about Linda. She cared deeply about her reputation. She loved throwing extravagant parties and hosting charity events, always desperate to be seen as an upstanding member of society. So I waited for the perfect opportunity. Months later, she and Richard hosted a massive charity gala. It was their pride and joy, with high-profile guests and local media in attendance. I volunteered to help organize it, playing the perfect daughter-in-law. They were suspicious at first, but the promise of my event planning skills won them over. The night of the event, everything was flawless, until I struck. First, I arranged for the catering company to deliver vegan dishes, despite Linda's well-known love for steak and seafood. She threw a fit in front of the guests, revealing her less-than-charitable attitude. Then, I had the event slideshow updated with a special segment, one that included footage from my wedding day. I had secretly gathered clips of all the things my in-laws had done. Linda's smug face during the ceremony, the seating chart sabotage, the DJ's confession about the dance switch. The room fell silent as everyone watched the horror unfold. Linda's face turned beet red. She tried to protest, but the evidence was undeniable. Guests murmured, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Her perfect image? Shattered. But the final blow came when I stepped up to the microphone. I just wanted to take a moment to thank my wonderful in-laws for teaching me a valuable lesson about resilience and standing up for myself, I said, my voice sweet as honey. Their actions at my wedding showed me exactly the kind of person I never want to be. The applause was deafening. Linda stormed out, humiliated. Richard followed, looking like he wanted to disappear. And Daniel? He took my hand and whispered, I think I just fell in love with you all over again. Revenge never tasted so sweet. After the gala, Linda went radio silent. No passive-aggressive texts, no fake sweet phone calls, nothing. It was eerie, like the calm before a storm. I half expected her to show up at our doorstep, fuming and ready to unleash hell. But weeks passed, and she remained a ghost. Daniel was torn. On one hand, he was proud of me for standing up for myself. On the other, he couldn't ignore that his relationship with his parents was now a smoldering wreck. They needed to see who they really are. I told him gently one night as we sat on the couch. I just held up the mirror. He nodded, but I could tell it hurt. 3 months later, they showed up, unannounced. I was home alone when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Linda and Richard standing there like the ghosts of Christmas past. Linda with her perfectly styled hair, Richard in his usual disapproving scowl. "We need to talk," Linda said, pushing past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. Richard followed, his silence heavier than usual. I closed the door, my heart racing, but I kept my face calm. Let the games begin. Linda didn't waste time. "You've humiliated us," she snapped, her facade of politeness gone. "Do you have any idea what you've done to our reputation?" "Oh, I think I do," I replied, crossing my arms. "It's called consequences." Richard finally spoke. "We're here because we want to fix things, for Daniel's sake." Ah, there it was. Not because they regretted their actions, but because they hated the fallout. "Fix things?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean pretend none of it happened so you can go back to treating me like garbage behind closed doors?" Linda's face twitched. She hated being called out. "We're willing to make amends," she said, her voice strained like it physically hurt her to say the words. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Then I smiled. "Great. Here's how we can start." I laid down 3 rules. 1. Respect. No more passive-aggressive comments, no undermining me in front of Daniel, and no sabotaging anything in my life. 2. Accountability. A public apology. Not just to me, but to my family for how they treated us at the wedding. 3. Boundaries. No more unannounced visits. They'd need to call first. Like normal people. Linda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "This isn't a negotiation," I said. "You either accept the terms or you lose access to your son. Your choice." For the first time, I had the power, and they knew it. They agreed, grudgingly. The apology was awkward and insincere, but they did it. At a small family gathering, Linda stood up, cleared her throat, and mumbled, "We're sorry if we caused any hurt during the wedding." If, of course. But it didn't matter. I had exposed them for who they were, set my boundaries, and reclaimed my dignity. And the best part? They hated every second of it. Daniel and I grew stronger through it all. He saw me not just as his wife, but as someone who refused to be disrespected. We built our own life, with friends and family who genuinely cared about us. As for Linda and Richard, they remained in the background, their influence over us gone. Because here's the thing about toxic people. They only have power if you let them. And I never would again. For a while, things were manageable. Linda and Richard kept their distance, their forced politeness like a brittle mask that could crack at any moment. They followed the rules. Barely. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they slipped. And slip they did. It happened during Daniel's birthday. We decided to keep it low-key, a small gathering with close friends and family. Against my better judgment, we invited Linda and Richard. I thought, maybe they've learned. Maybe they'll behave. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The evening started fine. They arrived on time, miracle, brought a gift, probably out of obligation, and even complimented the cake I'd baked. But as the night wore on and the wine flowed, Linda's true colors bled through. She cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low but sharp. "You know, no matter how hard you try, you'll never really be one of us," she hissed, her smile tight as she sipped her wine. "Daniel deserves better." I stared at her, my heart pounding, not with fear, but rage. After everything, she still couldn't help herself. I didn't respond. Not yet. I had a better idea. I'd learned something about Linda over the past year. She thrived on control. Her power came from subtle manipulations, whispered insults, and playing the victim when called out. But what if I took that control away? in a way she couldn't ignore. So I planned. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Linda was hosting another charity event, desperate to repair her image after the gala disaster. This time it was even bigger, a fundraiser with important donors, reporters, and local officials. I reached out to a journalist I knew, someone who specialized in exposés on community leaders with less than stellar reputations. I provided her with everything: footage from the wedding, recordings of Linda's snide comments, even emails where she badmouthed me to Daniel, trying to drive a wedge between us. The journalist was thrilled. The article dropped the morning of Linda's event, complete with the headline, "Behind the Curtain, the Toxic Truth About Linda's Last Name's Perfect Life." It went viral. Guests at her fundraiser whispered, side-eyed, and pulled out their phones mid-speech. Linda's smile grew tighter with each passing minute until she finally snapped, storming off stage, her carefully curated facade crumbling in real time. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "She's coming over," he said. "She's furious." Good. Linda arrived like a hurricane, slamming the door behind her. "How dare you!" she screeched, her face red with rage. "You've ruined me." I stayed calm. I'd been waiting for this. "No, Linda," I said quietly, standing tall. "You ruined yourself. I just held up the mirror." She sputtered, grasping for control she no longer had. Daniel stepped in then, his voice steady. "Mom, you've done nothing but try to tear us apart. This was bound to catch up with you." Her face twisted with betrayal, realizing her own son was done making excuses for her. She tried to argue, but the words fell flat. She wasn't the victim here, and for once, everyone knew it. After that night, we cut them off completely. No more forced gatherings, no more polite conversations, just silence. And you know what? It was peaceful. Daniel and I flourished without their toxic shadow looming over us. We built a life filled with love, respect, and laughter, free from manipulation and drama. Sometimes people think revenge is about anger, but for me, it was about freedom. The sweetest payback wasn't ruining Linda's reputation. It was living a life where she no longer mattered. For a while, life was exactly as it should have been. Quiet, peaceful, and filled with the kind of love and stability Linda and Richard could never have provided. Daniel and I traveled, built our careers, and eventually moved into a cozy house with a big porch and too many plants. All my fault, of course. We rarely spoke of his parents. It was as if cutting them off had snipped some invisible thread that had been pulling at us for years. But the thing about toxic people is, they don't fade away quietly. 2 years later, Linda came back. It started with a letter, a real, handwritten letter in delicate cursive on expensive stationery, like she thought that would soften the edges of everything she'd done. "Dear Daniel and my name, I know I am the last person you want to hear from, but I've been doing a lot of reflection. I realize I've made mistakes and I'd like the chance to make amends. Not just for me, but for the family we used to be. I'm not asking for forgiveness, only for the opportunity to speak with you both, face to face." With regret, Linda, I read it twice, my stomach tightening with a familiar knot. Daniel read it once and tossed it on the table like it was nothing more than junk mail. "What do you think?" I asked carefully. Daniel shrugged. "It's probably just another manipulation tactic. She's only sorry because she's lost control." I nodded, agreeing, but something about the letter stuck with me. It was too subdued. No guilt-tripping, no veiled insults. Just regret. It didn't feel like the Linda I knew. And that's what made me curious. Against Daniel's better judgment, I arranged to meet her. On neutral ground, a little cafe downtown where she couldn't cause a scene. Daniel came too, more out of obligation than interest. When Linda walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked older. Not just in the way time changes a person, but like life had finally caught up with her. The sharpness in her eyes had dulled, her confidence replaced by something brittle. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. We didn't respond. We waited. "I've been sick," she blurted out after a long pause. "Cancer. It's not going well." Silence. I wasn't sure what I expected. Another manipulation, a sob story with strings attached. But there was no drama in her voice. No theatrics. Just plain, harsh truth. "I know I don't deserve your time," she continued, her gaze fixed on her coffee cup. "I've been awful to you both. I thought if I controlled everything, I'd keep Daniel close. I didn't realize I was pushing him away." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. I could see the war inside him. Anger tangled with old love, resentment battling the ghost of the mother he'd wanted her to be. Linda reached into her bag and pulled out another envelope, sliding it across the table toward me. "This isn't to guilt you," she said. "It's just everything I never said. If you want to read it, you can. If not, that's okay." She stood up then, leaving her untouched coffee behind. "I'm sorry," she whispered before walking away. We sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the envelope like it might explode. "I don't care what's in it," Daniel finally said, his voice low. "She's too late." But later that night, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him open it. I never asked what it said. He never told me. Linda passed away 6 months later. We didn't attend the funeral. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no last-minute confessions, no perfect closure tied up with a neat little bow. And that's okay. Because life isn't always about perfect endings. Sometimes it's about learning when to hold on and when to let go. Daniel and I did just that. We lived, we loved, we grew. Her shadow never touched us again. After Linda's death, there was an unexpected sense of emptiness. Not grief exactly. More like the weight of a book you've been carrying for years suddenly disappearing from your bag. You'd think you'd feel lighter, but instead there's just an odd ache where the burden used to be. Daniel didn't talk much about it. He threw himself into work, long hours and late nights, as if keeping busy would keep the feelings at bay. I didn't push. I knew grief isn't always about missing someone. It's sometimes about mourning what could have been. But grief has a sneaky way of finding you, even when you think you've buried it deep. A few weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived from Linda's lawyer. "You are listed in the will of the late Linda. Last name. Please contact our office regarding matters of inheritance." Daniel laughed when he read it. What could she possibly have left me? A framed picture of herself? Curiosity got the better of us. We met with the lawyer, expecting something small. A token, maybe. But when he slid the documents across the polished desk, our jaws dropped. Linda had left Daniel everything. Her estate, her savings, even the house where Daniel grew up. It wasn't billionaire wealth, but it was substantial. Enough to change the course of our lives if we wanted it to. Daniel stared at the papers, his face unreadable. "She thinks she can buy her way back," he muttered. But it wasn't that simple. Because money isn't just money when it comes with emotional strings attached. It felt like her final attempt to control him from beyond the grave. Weeks passed, and the inheritance hung over us like an uninvited guest. Daniel didn't touch it. He wouldn't even talk about it. But I saw the conflict in his eyes. Anger battling with obligation, resentment tangled with guilt. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I finally broke the silence. "You don't owe her anything," I said softly. "But maybe this isn't about her. Maybe it's about what you do with it now." Daniel stared at the fading sky, his jaw tight. Then he whispered, "I don't want her name attached to anything in my life." And that's when the idea came to us. Instead of rejecting the inheritance, or worse, letting it rot, we decided to flip the script. We used it to build something Linda would have never expected. A community center. A place for kids from difficult families where they could find support, mentorship, and a safe space to be themselves. No judgment, no manipulation, just kindness. We named it the Phoenix Center. because it was born from ashes. Daniel poured his heart into the project. I watched as he healed, not through forgetting, but through transforming his pain into something meaningful. Years later, standing at the grand opening of the center, surrounded by laughter and hope, Daniel squeezed my hand. "She's not my story anymore," he said quietly. And he was right. Linda's shadow had loomed over us for so long, but in the end, it wasn't her legacy that mattered. It was ours. Not defined by toxicity, not by bitterness, but by what we chose to create from it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't payback. It's peace. The Phoenix Center flourished in ways we never expected. It wasn't just a building. It became a symbol. A place where brokenness didn't define you, where people could rewrite their own stories. Every time Daniel and I walked through its doors, it felt like shedding another layer of the past. But life has a way of circling back when you least expect it. One evening, as we locked up after a long day of mentoring sessions, Daniel found an envelope slipped under the door. No return address, just his name written in that same delicate cursive we both recognized instantly, Richard's handwriting. We stared at it in silence. Linda's ghost wasn't the only one lingering. We didn't open the letter right away. It sat on the kitchen counter for days, an unspoken weight between us. Daniel was distant, retreating into himself like he used to when things got tough. But this time, I didn't wait for him to process it alone. One morning, over coffee, I pushed the envelope toward him. "Whatever it says, it doesn't control us," I said softly. "But maybe it's time to read it." He hesitated, then slowly tore it open. "Dear Daniel, I've been thinking about writing this for years. I just never had the courage. Or maybe I didn't want to face what I'd done. I was a coward. I let your mother's bitterness shape me, and I failed you as a father. I watched her tear you down, and instead of standing up for you, I stood by her side because it was easier. I thought loyalty to her was more important than being the father you needed. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if there's any part of you that can believe this, I'm sorry. Not because life dealt me regret, but because you deserved better than me." Richard Daniel read it twice. Then he folded it neatly, set it on the table, and stared at the wall for a long time. Finally, he spoke. He thinks saying sorry makes it all go away. But his voice wasn't filled with anger, just exhaustion. A week later, we found ourselves driving to a small, run-down apartment complex across town. Daniel hadn't planned to respond to the letter, but something had shifted in him. He didn't want to carry unanswered questions anymore. When Richard opened the door, he looked smaller than I remembered. Age and guilt had hollowed him out. He didn't smile, didn't pretend. Just stepped aside, silently inviting us in. The conversation was raw. No pleasantries, no sugarcoating. Just truth. "You don't get to show up in my life now and expect anything," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady. "But I'm here because I need to understand why." Richard didn't have excuses, just regrets. He spoke about fear, weakness, and the power of denial. He admitted he was too afraid to stand up to Linda, too ashamed to face the damage after she was gone. It wasn't a magical moment of healing. No dramatic hugs, no tearful reconciliation. Just two broken men sitting in the silence between what was and what could have been. But sometimes, that's enough. We left that day with no plans to return, no promises to rebuild. But Daniel walked out lighter, as if finally setting down a burden he'd carried his whole life. Back at the Phoenix Center, he stood in front of a group of teens from difficult homes. Kids who knew the sting of abandonment, betrayal, and broken promises. And he said, "Your past doesn't get to write your story. You do." Watching him speak those words, I realized something. Closure isn't about perfect endings. It's about choosing what parts of the story you carry with you, and what parts you leave behind. We chose to leave the pain. We chose to carry the growth. Life after that final meeting with Richard felt quieter, as if the echoes of the past had finally faded into the background. But healing isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it comes in ripples, small, unexpected moments that catch you off guard. One of those moments came on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel and I were at the Phoenix Center, sorting through donations when a teenager named Marcus stormed in, slamming his backpack onto the floor. He was one of the toughest kids we'd worked with, sharp-tongued, guarded, and angry at the world. Daniel approached him cautiously. "Rough day?" Marcus scoffed. "My dad's out of prison. Sent me a letter. Thinks he can just waltz back into my life like nothing happened." The words hit Daniel like a lightning strike. I saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, the flicker of something dark crossing his face. But instead of shutting down, he sat beside Marcus, silent for a moment before speaking. "You know," Daniel began, his voice low, "I got a letter like that once." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" Daniel didn't give advice. He didn't preach. He just told his story. The wedding disaster, the toxic in-laws, the years of bitterness, the letter from a father who didn't deserve forgiveness. "And?" Marcus pressed. Daniel shrugged. "I met him. Not for him. For me. So I wouldn't carry his mistakes like they were mine. Turns out facing it didn't fix the past, but it freed me from it." Marcus didn't respond, but something shifted in his expression. A crack in the wall he'd built. Months later, on a chilly autumn afternoon, we were closing up the center when a familiar figure appeared at the door. It was Richard. My heart tightened. I glanced at Daniel, expecting anger, or maybe indifference. But Daniel simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. Richard didn't come with apologies this time. He came with something simpler. "I heard about the center," he said, his voice raspy with age. "It's impressive." Daniel nodded again, waiting. "I don't want anything from you," Richard continued. "I just thought maybe I could help, volunteer, fix things around the place. No strings." The tension in the room was thick. I held my breath, waiting for Daniel's response. After a long silence, Daniel said, "This place isn't about fixing the past. It's about building something new. If you're here for that, fine. No forgiveness, no father-son reunion, just acceptance." Richard became a quiet fixture at the center, fixing leaky faucets, repainting walls, repairing broken chairs. He never asked for more, and Daniel never offered it. Their relationship wasn't defined by titles like father or son. It was just two people, broken in different ways, finding purpose in the same place. Years later, when Richard passed away, Daniel didn't shed tears, but he did one thing that surprised me. He kept a photo of the center's opening day, with Richard in the background tucked into his office drawer. Not as a tribute to Richard, but as a reminder that even the most damaged parts of our past can be repurposed into something meaningful. The Phoenix Center grew beyond what we ever imagined. More locations, more kids, more stories of resilience. And Daniel? He became a man not defined by his parents' failures, but by his own choices. One day, while giving a speech to a new group of kids, he said something that stayed with me forever. "Your story doesn't start with who hurt you. It starts with what you do next." That was our legacy. Not the pain, not the past, but what came after. Years passed, and the Phoenix Center became more than just a place. It was a living testament to resilience. Every wall whispered stories of kids who found hope after heartbreak. Every corner held echoes of laughter that had replaced years of silence. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One day, Daniel received a call that would stir the past once again. It was from a lawyer. Apparently, Linda had another secret. A second will, tucked away in a safe deposit box no one knew existed. The lawyer explained that it had recently surfaced after someone claimed it during an audit of old accounts. "What now?" Daniel muttered, staring at the phone like it was a ghost come back to haunt him. Curiosity won. We went to the lawyer's office, expecting, well, who knows what. Maybe another controlling gesture from beyond the grave. Maybe nothing at all. But what we found shook us both. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Linda. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know I wasn't the mother you deserved. I spent my life trying to control everything because I was terrified. Terrified of being forgotten, of not mattering. I realize now that I mattered in the worst ways possible. This isn't an apology. I don't deserve to ask for forgiveness. But I wanted you to know something. I saw you. I saw how strong you were, even when I pretended not to. I hated that strength because it reminded me of what I'd lost in myself. I hope someday you'll build a life that has nothing to do with me. And maybe, just maybe, this letter will be the last time I ever have a say in it. No money, no hidden assets, just words." Daniel sat there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Then he chuckled, a dry, bitter sound that slowly softened. "She finally said the one thing I needed," he whispered. "That I mattered, even if it was for the wrong reasons." Back at the center, Daniel pinned the letter inside his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that closure doesn't always come wrapped in neat packages. Sometimes it's messy, tangled, and imperfect. Inspired by that letter, we started a new program at the Phoenix Center, a support group for kids dealing with toxic family relationships. Not therapy, just a space where they could say the things they were too afraid to admit out loud. One day, a girl named Ava stood up in front of the group. She'd been quiet for weeks, barely speaking above a whisper. But that day, she cleared her throat and said, "I thought my mom's voice would be stuck in my head forever. But I think I'm finally hearing my own voice now." Her words hit Daniel hard. After the session, he turned to me, his eyes glassy but filled with something new. Peace. "You know," he said softly, "maybe that's what life's really about. Not erasing the voices that hurt us, but learning to speak louder than them." Years later, when Daniel and I sat down to write the history of the Phoenix Center, we didn't start with the toxic in-laws, the ruined wedding, or the bitter family feuds. We started with this. Once, there was a man who thought his past defined him, but he learned that even ashes can grow something beautiful if you choose to plant the right seeds. Because in the end, the story was never about Linda or Richard. It was about Daniel. It was about us. It was about what we chose to do next. And this time, that's truly the end. Or maybe just the beginning. Years passed, and the Phoenix Center's walls grew crowded with framed photos, smiling faces, graduation caps tossed midair, kids who'd come in broken and left whole. But for Daniel and me, life wasn't just about what we'd built outside. It was also about what we carried inside. One evening, as we watched the sunset from our porch, Daniel turned to me with a quiet look in his eyes, the kind that meant he'd been sitting with a thought for a long time. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe it's time we start a family." His words hung in the air, delicate and heavy all at once. We'd avoided the topic for years, partly because the idea of becoming parents scared us. How could we raise a child when we'd both been shaped by parents who failed us? But maybe that's exactly why we were ready. We knew what not to do. Adoption felt like the natural path. Not because we couldn't have children, but because we'd already seen the power of chosen family through the Phoenix Center. That's how we met Lily. She was 10 when we first saw her. A fiery little thing with tangled hair, sharp eyes, and a glare that could cut glass. She'd bounced around foster homes, convinced that love was just another word for disappointment. In many ways, she was like Daniel. Earning her trust was like peeling layers off an onion, slow and full of tears. She'd test us, push us, waiting for the moment we'd give up. But we didn't. One night, after she'd had a meltdown over something small, like the wrong color of cereal bowl, I found her sitting on the porch steps, hugging her knees. "I'm not easy to love, you know," she mumbled. I sat beside her, staring out at the dark sky. Good thing love's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be real. She didn't respond, but a week later, she slipped a crumpled note under our bedroom door. "Okay, Maybe I love you back, but don't get weird about it. Daniel laughed so hard he cried. Raising Lily wasn't a fairy tale. There were bad days, slammed doors, silent dinners, and therapy appointments. But there were also victories. The first time she called Daniel Dad by accident. The day she stood in front of her class and gave a presentation about her family. The night she whispered, "I'm glad you picked me." One evening, years later, Lily sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old photo album. She pointed at a picture of Daniel and Richard from one of the few days they'd shared at the center. "Was he a good grandpa?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, then smiled softly. "He wasn't good at being a dad, but he tried to be better at the end. Sometimes that's all people can do. Try to be better before it's too late." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "I think trying matters." And just like that, the weight of generations seemed to lift. When Daniel and I grew older, we passed the Phoenix Center to Lily. She didn't just run it. She transformed it, adding programs for foster youth, trauma recovery, and even leadership training for kids who never believed they could lead. At the grand reopening, she gave a speech that left us both in tears. "My parents taught me that your past doesn't define you. Your choices do. They broke the cycle so I wouldn't have to. And now I get to help others do the same." She paused, her eyes finding us in the crowd. "This isn't just a center. It's proof that love can outgrow pain, that healing isn't linear, and that family isn't always who you're born to. It's who you choose." And as the applause echoed, I realized something. The story never really ends. It just keeps growing, like a phoenix, rising again and again. Years rolled on, and the Phoenix Center thrived under Lily's leadership, becoming a beacon for those who thought they were too broken to be whole again. Daniel and I often joked that we'd retired, but the truth was, you never really retire from something that's part of your soul. One rainy afternoon, Daniel and I sat on the porch, watching the droplets race down the windows. His hand, weathered but strong, found mine. There was a quietness between us that only comes with years of shared memories. Some beautiful, some painful, all woven into the fabric of who we'd become. "Do you ever think about the beginning?" he asked softly. I smiled. "The wedding?" He chuckled. "The disaster of a wedding, the toxic in-laws, the mess. Funny how something so awful became the start of everything good." And he was right. If not for that ruined day, we might have never found the strength to build something better. Not just for us, but for so many others. Not long after, Lily surprised us with news. She was pregnant. Her face, usually so confident and composed, was a mix of excitement and terror. "What if I screw it up?" she whispered one evening, sitting with us in the dim glow of the living room lamp. Daniel reached over, his voice steady. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because you've already done the hardest thing. You broke the cycle." When Lily's son Mateo was born, it felt like the universe had come full circle. Holding him for the first time, Daniel's eyes shimmered with emotions he never had words for. He wasn't just holding a baby. He was holding proof that healing isn't just possible. It's contagious. As Mateo grew, he became a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. He'd visit the center with Lily, running through the halls, asking endless questions about the framed photos on the walls. One day, he found an old, faded picture of Daniel as a young man, standing beside Richard. "Who's that with you, Grandpa?" Mateo asked. Daniel paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "That's my dad." Was he nice? A simple question, a complicated answer, but Daniel didn't flinch. He wasn't always, but he tried to be better at the end, and sometimes that's enough. Mateo nodded, satisfied with the answer, and ran off to chase another adventure. Years later, after Daniel passed peacefully in his sleep, the center held a memorial, not one draped in sadness, but in celebration. People from all walks of life showed up. Former students, families he'd helped, and even old staff members whose lives he'd touched. Lily stood at the podium, her voice steady but her heart full. My dad taught me that life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about growing through it. He was proof that you can carry your past without letting it define you. He built something beautiful from the ashes and will keep it alive. She paused, looking at me with tears glistening in her eyes. Dad always said, "Your story doesn't start with who hurt you. It starts with what you do next." And what we'll do next is keep telling his story through every life the Phoenix Center touches. And as I sat there, surrounded by a sea of people whose lives Daniel had changed, I realized something profound. The story never really ends. It lives on, in hearts, in legacies, in every new beginning born from the ashes of what once was. Just like a phoenix. After Daniel's passing, the days felt quieter, like the world had lost a steady drumbeat I'd grown used to hearing. His absence wasn't just in the empty chair at the dinner table or the missing laugh during late-night talks. It was woven into the spaces between moments. But grief is strange. It doesn't just take. It gives, too. It gives clarity, perspective, and an unexpected kind of strength. Lily and I leaned into that strength. The Phoenix Center became not just Daniel's legacy, but ours. A living testament to survival, growth, and the undeniable power of second chances. A few months after the memorial, while cleaning out Daniel's old study, I found a letter tucked away in the back of a drawer. It was addressed to me. If you're reading this, it means I've already left. But don't be sad. Not too sad anyway. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love doesn't die with us. It stays. In the things we've built, the people we've touched, and the stories we leave behind. You were the best part of my story. And if you ever wonder what comes next, just look around. It's already happening. In every life you've changed, in every heart that's healing because of you. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling his words like a warm embrace. Years passed. Mateo grew into a young man, curious, passionate, and stubborn in the best ways. He'd inherited Daniel's quiet strength and my relentless determination, a combination that often made me smile and occasionally sigh. One day, he approached me with an idea. "I want to expand the Phoenix Center," he said, eyes alight with purpose. "Not just here. I want to open new branches in places that need it most." Dad's story. It doesn't have to stay in one place. Hearing him call Daniel Dad without hesitation filled me with pride and a bittersweet ache. We worked side by side, traveling to new cities, meeting kids who carried the same shadows Daniel once did. Each center we opened felt like planting a seed, and soon the Phoenix Center wasn't just a building. It was a movement. Decades later, at the grand opening of the 10th Phoenix Center, Mateo gave a speech. "My family taught me that you don't have to be defined by where you come from. You can choose who you become. This center isn't just about healing. It's about rewriting your story." He paused, glancing at me in the front row. My grandfather's life was proof that even when everything falls apart, you can rise again. Not despite the ashes, but because of them. As the crowd erupted in applause, I felt tears slip down my cheeks. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of it all. Eventually, when my own time drew near, I wasn't afraid. I knew our story wouldn't end with me because it never really began with me either. It was bigger than Daniel and me, bigger than Lily, bigger than Mateo. It was every person who'd ever walked through the doors of the Phoenix Center, every life touched, every heart mended. On my final day, I wrote one last letter. If you're reading this, it means my part of the story is over. But don't be sad. Not too sad anyway. Because stories like ours don't end. They echo in every life we've touched, in every heart still beating because we dared to rise. Keep rising. Always. And with that, I closed my eyes, knowing the story would live on. Like a phoenix. Always rising. Forever.